Imperialism. Imperialism, empire. That's what those British do. Maybe the French, maybe the Dutch. That's what those colonists in North America fought a war, Revolutionary War, to break away from. Then why are we talking about it in the 1890s? Because the U.S. had their own imperialist stage, and a lot of us like to gloss over this, but it was very much part of our history. And there are three theories on how this happened. I'm going to quick run through that before we get to what we're doing today. And most of this happens in the 1890s, remember. And some say that it was just a 20-year hiccup. We became an imperialist for 20 years, and oops, all of a sudden we were colonial power, but then we kind of got our minds right in World War I and went back to being the good guys. Okay? Second theory is that we were always trying to expand. That the United States was always an expansionist empire. It's just the U.S. had spent so much time trying to take over and take control of North America that it hadn't been able to expand outwards yet, and this was a natural expansion of that. Okay. Third, this is one we're going to spend a little time on, that throughout the later half of the 19th century, because the U.S. government was trying so hard to support industrial corporations at home and overseas, that the country simply overcommitted themselves. That they committed themselves to economic dominance of the world, or at least economic dominance of the Western Hemisphere. And when they did that, and once they truly committed to that, they were forced to back it up with military might, and in this case, economic imperialism, which became military imperialism. Alright, now, you know from your reading that when this really starts, when it really takes off, and when it really dominates is the Spanish-American War. You're going to read all about it. You'll know all about the Cuban Revolution, William Randolph Hearst, and the Yellow Press, Battleship Maine, and the Philippines and what comes after. Your book covered that really well. What I want to run through real quick is what came before that. Because the one thing we need to understand is that something led up to this. This economic imperialism move to military imperialism concept had a background before the Spanish-American War. So I'm just going to look at a couple events. Four specifically. First, 1888, the Haitian Revolution. Well, one of the many Haitian revolutions. The U.S. actually supported a faction group. The U.S. actually flooded money into Haiti to support a faction group to take over for the leader of Haiti, because that faction group promised that they would give exclusive trade agreements to U.S. companies. So the United States government backed them financially. It was the reason they actually won. Fast forward, 1894, Brazilian Revolution. A lot of revolutions going on in the late 19th century down there. There was a rebellion that was actually set to overthrow the government. They had the support of most of the people. They had the larger army. It was clear they were going to overthrow the government. Thing is, the present government in Brazil had these exclusive trade agreements with the U.S. that they would only trade certain things with the U.S. So the U.S. is going to send a couple of battleships down there. Literally, they are going to send a series of battleships, and they are going to set them right off the Capitol. And they are going to point the guns at the Capitol, and they're going to sit there. They're not going to say anything. They're not going to threaten. They're just going to put great big battleships, just enough to intimidate. The thing we have to remember is, what does Brazil produce? They are still the major producer of it. It is sugar cane. It's where, before the U.S. started developing sugar beets, it's where most of the sugar came from. And if you remember from your reading from a couple weeks ago, the Sugar Trust which controls 98% of all the sugar refinement in the U.S. and therefore the entire Western Hemisphere, has a lot of power with Congressmen. Okay. Third on our little list here, 1895, the very next year, Venezuela. Um, there was what we call the Venezuelan crisis. Essentially, the English, who had owned a colony called Guyana right next door to Venezuela, decided they want to expand Guyana, and so they want to expand it into independent Venezuela. Um, well, the U.S. threatened the British to back down. The problem is the U.S. does not have as big of a military as England does at this time. So the U.S. had to justify it somehow. They had to give some kind of legal reasoning, or the British couldn't just back down with any kind of honor. So what the U.S. did is they invoked something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this is old. This was written 80 years ago by the 5th President, James Monroe. And it said, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered subjects or considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers, meaning that no European power can come in and colonize anything else in the Western Hemisphere, and that the U.S. was going to back that up. Well, 80 years before this, the U.S. couldn't back it up. I mean, it had a couple of ships, and they couldn't back it up. It was an idle threat. There was reasons behind it. No one had paid attention to it for 80 years. But now that the U.S. was invoking that, it kind of locks them into doing that. It locks them into holding that control. And by the way, if you haven't gathered, the reason why the U.S. was so protective of Venezuela is because several major corporations, including, yes, the Sugar Trust, were heavily invested down there. A lot of agricultural resources that were supporting some of the major industries in the U.S. were actually coming out of Venezuela, or at least being shipped through Venezuela. All right. This all doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Okay, you invoke the Monroe Doctrine, whatever. We'll give you another one. We'll give you a fourth one, and it's Hawaii. 1898. Again, jumping a couple years. There was this worry that the U.S. Would lose control of Hawaii. There was kind of this independence movement there, and the sugar plantations were being threatened. The Queen of Hawaii was claiming she was going to nationalize or claiming she was going to tax the sugar plantations. Now, the U.S. does not own Hawaii, but the U.S. has set up a base there, and the U.S. sugar plantations have opened up there, and the rest of the sugar that's not being produced in Brazil and Venezuela is being produced there. So the U.S. annexes Hawaii. They make Hawaii part of the United States. The Queen did not agree to this. The people did not agree to this. They just kind of do it. All right. Again, we're seeing a pattern here. America kind of enforcing militarily to support U.S. industries. And so you're saying, what's this have to do with the Spanish-American War? Well, the problem with the Spanish-American War, sure, there were U.S. interests in Cuba. But the problem is, once in 1895, the U.S. committed to the Monroe Doctrine and said that defiantly to all European powers that any European power who comes in will be fought. Well, in 1898, when the Cuban Revolution breaks out, and Spain sends troops to take over an area that they may or may not have controlled, all of a sudden, in order to follow the law of the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. has to get involved. It's this problem. As you escalate to help U.S. corporations and make more and more commitments and grander statements, eventually you talk yourself into a corner that your only choice is to back them up with warfare. This seems to be what happened. Read the chapter. Let's discuss the Spanish-American War. Let's see if we can't get a little more about this. We'll see you next week.